Hello. I'd now like to take us into Article 2 of the Constitution. It is general provisions, but it deals with several things that you at first may think are not terribly important, but you may find out later in your law practice that they are extremely important. One of the reasons I wanted to treat Article 2 quite early on is it lays down the general principles about how government is organized with very specific separation of powers provisions, provisions that you will not find in the federal Constitution, even though separation of powers is implied in the federal Constitution, but it's quite explicit in the Florida Constitution. And when you get to the case law, you'll find out that Florida really stands out as one of the states where separation of powers is particularly important. I want to linger some time on the boundaries provision for reasons that I'll try to explain as we go through that. At least touch on other general provisions that don't make all that much difference. We should spend some time on the ethics in government language, which I confess I helped draft, and which was largely a mistake because it was drafted in a way that would not stand constitutional scrutiny today. But with that confession, let's get started thinking about, first of all, what our objectives are, and of course to analyze the general provisions of Article 2, to understand the boundaries of Florida, because they become important for what the jurisdiction of Florida is. And as we've already said, within our boundaries we have both federal installations, ports, airports, military facilities, and Indian reservations that are not subject to the jurisdiction of Florida, but nonetheless are within the boundaries of Florida. And then we need to understand the special role that separation of powers plays in the Florida Constitution, to understand the principles of dual office holding, and to take a quick cut at the ethics provisions in the Constitution. First of all, Florida boundaries. I've made allusion to this in earlier lectures, but let's get really quite specific now about the Florida boundaries. The early constitutions had Florida boundaries designated, but they were not always in the kind of detail that we ultimately find in the 1868 Constitution. And as we've said earlier, by accepting the 1868 Constitution as a constitution which brought Florida back into the Union, we now have Congress approving the 1868 Constitution, and thereby, according to court decisions, approving the boundaries that are set forth in the 1868 Constitution. So let's take a look first of all at Florida overall. This is what Florida looks like with its modern counties. Note that we no longer have Mosquito County. We have a number of counties along the east coast of Florida, south of St. John's, that were one time earlier designated as Mosquito County. It may be that our chambers of commerce did not want to keep up the designation of Mosquito County. But now let's begin to trace the boundaries. This is to know Florida, and an awful lot of what we're now going to discuss are boundaries that are governed by rivers. And we begin in our discussion with the Perdido River. So we begin at the mouth of the Perdido River. This is over now, obviously west of Pensacola. And as you go into the mouth of the Perdido River, you'll find that you're entering a river that is not a straight line. It meanders around a little bit. Those of you who like canoeing or kayaking may go on the Perdido River and notice that it's not a giant body of water, but one that's quite attractive, still quite wild in most respects. And you go up the middle of the Perdido River until the Perdido River touches the state of Alabama. notice that, that the Perdido River is quite crooked in places after the mouth of the Perdido River. But the boundary now goes to the point, goes up the middle of the river until the river intersects with the south boundary of the state of Alabama. So Florida intersects with Alabama, and then the boundaries of Florida move to the east along the 31st parallel, and it moves to the point where the 31st parallel gets to the middle of the Chattahoochee River. And the Chattahoochee River now flows out of Georgia. It's part of the Apalachicola Chattahoochee Flint River system. It is, as you probably know, a notable body of water. It's the subject of Sidney Lanier's great poem, Out of the Hills of Habersham, Down the Valley of Hall, I hurry amain to reach the plain, run the rapid and leap the fall, split at the rock and together again, accept my bed, or narrow or wide, and flee from folly on every side, with a lover's pain to attain the plain, far from the hills of Habersham, far from the valleys of Hall. So it begins north of Atlanta, and it flows down to the point where it joins the Flint River. The Chattahoochee River now runs from north of Atlanta, comes down and forms for a period for area a boundary between Georgia and Alabama, and then continues to flow south until it joins with the Flint River, which comes in to the east of the Chattahoochee River, and where the two of those join is a little town called Chattahoochee, a place where I grew up. And Chattahoochee in colonial times, you probably understand, became a point of great strategic importance, because if you're running the old Spanish Trail from St. Augustine to Pensacola, and you're trying to figure out what route that is going to take, you don't want to have to man two ferry stations or have two forts guarding your ferry stations. You want to do one. And so rather than going a little bit north of what is now present-day Chattahoochee, Florida, you cross at the point where the Chattahoochee and Flint rivers come together and form the Apalachicola River. And our boundary now is down the Chattahoochee to the point where there's a confluence between the Chattahoochee and the Flint. And so we now have a wonderful area where we have Georgia and Florida meeting. Remember, just north on the Chattahoochee River, we have Alabama and Florida, that boundary ending. And so if you build a dam right at the confluence of the Chattahoochee and Flint River, you have a dam that impacts 3 states. 3 states means 6 senators. And if you back up the water from this dam into a large area, which is now called Lake Seminole, you'll back it up into Georgia and Alabama, and you'll actually impact 5 congressional districts, so 6 senators and 5 congressional districts. You've got an absolutely perfect place for political engineering to place a dam. And so the dam is located at the confluence of the two rivers. The dam begins in Georgia on the eastern side of the Apalachicola and goes to the western side, which is Florida. And so you have a dam whose structure is in 2 states, and the water formed by the dam, behind the dam, which forms Lake Seminole, actually touches in 3 states and becomes a very important point of geography, but it also provides us with our point for Florida boundary. And the Florida boundary now extends to the east from this point and goes to in a straight line to the head of the St. Mary's River. And so look, as we begin on the Petito River, we start off in West Florida. We go across Florida, reach the Chattahoochee River, go down to the point where the Chattahoochee and the Flint join, then go across North Florida, find the St. Mary's River, and follow the St. Mary's River. Look how crooked this is, and follow the St. Mary's River until it dumps into the Atlantic Ocean. And so you go down the middle of the St. Mary's River to the Atlantic Ocean. Now, what do you do then? And this becomes extremely interesting. And for those of you who've been sailors or been out in the Atlantic Ocean off of Florida, you'll recognize how significant this next step is. The Florida boundaries now, according to the 1968 Constitution, preserved in the 1868 Constitution, preserved in the 1968 Constitution, their boundaries now go to the edge of the Gulf Stream. Now I would very much like it if any of you are able to tell me today the latitude and longitude of the edge of the Gulf Stream that's east of the mouth of the St. Mary's River. Those of you who've traveled the Gulf Stream understand that on a given day, it can be anywhere. The Gulf Stream moves. There's not a static body of water. And the edge of the Gulf Stream is now, once the Gulf Stream gets off of Jacksonville, is really quite far from the shores of Florida. So we now go some distance from Florida, the distance depending on where the edge of the Gulf Stream is on that particular day, to find the boundary of Florida. You won't find it marked in the Gulf Stream. You're just going to have to figure out where the Gulf Stream is that day. And so here's the problem. You're a lawyer and you're representing a steamship company that runs these cruises to nowhere. The cruises to nowhere essentially provide for gambling cruises, and they leave a port and will not allow gambling until they get into international water. So they get beyond the boundaries of the state, and once they're in international waters, they'll open the gambling casino. So now, if you're advising a steamship company running out of Jacksonville about how to most rapidly get their gambling operation into play, what do you tell them to do about the course they should steer once they leave Jacksonville and head into the Atlantic? Do you go due east? No, I don't think so. I think at this point you probably turn northeast and get north as soon as you can, because you want to be off the coast of Georgia, not off the coast of Florida. If you're off the coast of Florida, you're going to have to go all the way, take your ship all the way to the edge of the Gulf Stream, wherever that is on this particular day. But if you're off the coast of Georgia, you go essentially 3 miles out into the Atlantic Ocean, and you're into international waters. So that's a practical application. It's not the only one that you'll see. But you then, to trace the boundary of Florida, you now go along the edge of the Gulf Stream, and you're going now in a southerly direction along the edge of the Gulf Stream, are 3 geographic miles to the Atlantic coastline and 3 leagues distant from the Gulf of Mexico coastline, whichever is greater. So along the Atlantic coastline, you're 3 miles away, or you're at the edge of the Gulf Stream. As you look at the Gulf Stream as it's close to Miami, which is quite far south, you'll find that the Gulf Stream is quite close to land. It separates from Florida the further north it gets. So now we are 3 miles, essentially 1 league out in the ocean on the Atlantic side. But when you move to the Gulf of Mexico and move around, you're now are 3 leagues. So what's the difference between, first of all, geographic miles and nautical miles? The difference is a few hundred feet. The nautical mile is measured as a mile as 1/60th of a degree of latitude on the globe, and that's the way we measure a distance. A nautical mile, a geographical mile, is identified as 5,280 feet. A nautical mile is approximately 6,000 feet, although the precise figure is a little bit over 6,000. And what is a league? You know the term league because it's a term that has been used in poetry. Again, you've probably memorized at some point in your academic career at least a few lines from Tennyson's great poem about the charge of the Light Brigade. The Light Brigade, remember, is charging half a league onward. The half a league is what? 1.5 miles. It's approximately the distance that a person can walk in an hour. Actually, my sense is that a person who's walking at a decent rate can walk about 4 miles an hour, but for historic purposes, a league is 3 miles, and so 3 leagues is approximately 9 miles. So as we look along the Atlantic coast, it's the edge of the Gulf Stream are 3 miles. And along the Gulf of Mexico, it is now 3 leagues or 9 miles from Florida. I won't linger longer on the charge of the Light Brigade. Let's continue on with the Florida boundary. We now go around Florida, go around the Keys, go around Keys that we know, Key West, which we know quite well. We'll get to Cedar Key later. Key West now has a series of keys that go even beyond Key West and goes on to a series of keys that include the Dry Tortugas. Dry Tortugas, in the eastern portion of the Dry Tortugas, includes a wonderful key that has Fort Jefferson on it. Fort Jefferson has a federal fort. It was the fort where Dr. Mudd was confined following the assassination of President Lincoln. Dr. Mudd is the person who treated President Lincoln's assailant and was arrested and kept in prison on Fort Jefferson. Fort Jefferson sits way out at the end of the Dry Tortugas and forms a boundary for Florida. Now, when we finish this, we now will go along the coast of Florida, along the Gulf Coast of Florida. And remember, we're 3 leagues off the coast of Florida. And so the outermost island of Florida, it might be Cedar Key, might be Longboat Key. Up near Pensacola is Santa Rosa Island. The boundary of Florida is 3 leagues off the coastline. So Florida has a boundary line that now is further out from Florida's land than the boundaries of adjoining states, Alabama to the west, Georgia to the north. And so as we begin to look at the control that Florida has over portions of the ocean, we find greater control by Florida on the east coast, because it goes out to the edge of the Gulf Stream down to close to the tip of Florida, where we get 3 miles off of Miami, and then around to the Gulf Coast, where we get 3 leagues or 9 miles of territory, whereas Alabama, for instance, to the west, only has 3 miles of territory into the Gulf of Mexico. If there's oil in the Gulf of Mexico, it may make some difference to you about whether your boundary is 3 miles or 9 miles. But Florida has the better of that. So what difference does this make to lawyers? And I want to draw on my personal experience, if I may. Back some years ago, I handled a case for a NBC cameraman and his family. He was killed in an accident. He actually disappeared in a helicopter accident. The NBC camera crew went to the Bahamas to record an incident where boat people from Haiti had been stranded on an island that was controlled by the Bahamian authorities, and the Bahamian authorities sent the Bahamian Coast Guard to evict these Haitians from the island. It was really quite a dramatic episode, because the Haitians really had no boat and no way to leave, and so it involved this humanitarian crisis where the Bahamian authorities had to come up with some way to get the Haitians off the island. And when they did that, their activity attracted the attention of several news organizations, including NBC. And so NBC had a helicopter fly into the Bahamas, and ultimately the helicopter went back from the site where the Haitian refugees went back to Andros Island, and then flew from Andros Island back to West Palm Beach, which was where the helicopter was based. In this process of going from Andros Island in the Bahamas over to West Palm Beach, they encountered a line squall, a storm that was in the straits between Florida and the Bahamas. And when they encountered this line storm, the line squall, they went down. The helicopter went down. Everybody disappeared. And so the issue is, did the helicopter go down in Florida waters or Bahamian waters? And to my clients, it made a tremendous difference. If it went down in Bahamian waters, there were very restricted recovery under Bahamian law. Bahamian law simply did not allow for the kind of monetary recovery that Florida law allowed. And so it was extremely important for our case and for our clients to be able to demonstrate that the helicopter went down in Florida waters. Well, happily, a piece of wreckage was found on a small island north of Bimini, and it carried, remarkably, the hull number of the helicopter. And so it clearly came from this helicopter. It was just a piece of the helicopter, which had some empty portions inside of it, and it actually floated and carried over to this small island in the Bahamas. And we were able to establish through the use of oceanographers and climate specialists the fact that the Gulf Stream and the prevailing winds would have carried this piece of wreckage from a place within the boundary of Florida, that is, on the eastern side of the edge of the Gulf Stream, which would have meant that the helicopter went down in Florida waters and were able to achieve a result achieved through a settlement after demonstrating that the helicopter likely was in Florida waters. So that's the kind of use that lawyers can make of the Florida boundaries. And if you have a case that involves Florida boundaries, and there have been a number of them, including incidents that have occurred on cruise ships, where it becomes very important to know whether the accident occurred within Florida boundaries or whether it was further offshore, applying the jurisdiction, applying the laws of some other jurisdiction. Now, I'm continuing through Article 2 and looking at less interesting provisions. Seat of government is in Tallahassee, unless some kind of emergency that calls for the capital to be relocated. So this is a matter of constitutional law, has been for a number of years, and the attempts back in the early 1970s, late 1960s, to move the capital to Orlando would have required a constitutional amendment, and that simply never happened. The branches of government become very important in Florida constitutional law, and we'll spend some time when you turn to the case law under Article 2 looking at the separation of powers. And what you will learn from this is that drawing on these very definite words, very specific provisions in the Florida Constitution, the Florida requires more separation than does the federal Constitution. So when you've looked at delegation of powers, for instance, under the federal Constitution, make sure you understand that the principles allowing delegation differ in federal law from Florida law. Florida law is much more strict in prohibiting delegations of power to subordinate bodies and delegation between branches of government. We have a provision which is absolutely useless, saying that the design of the Great Seal of the state shall be prescribed by law. What happens if this provision is not in the state constitution? The legislature, if not prohibited from having designing the Great Seal, could very well do it. And the same thing relates to the state flag. The legislature could decide what the design is of the state flag. Now, you see the design of the state flag as it exists today, but you probably don't recognize the design of the state flag as it originally existed in Florida, with the multicolor colors on the flag, and with the words, "Let us alone," inscribed on the orange banner going across the flag. But happily, that is not the Florida flag today. The public office provision is important. It provides that no person shall have more than one office in Florida. Now, this provision also has an oath of office that's prescribed. The dual office holding provision of the Constitution now says that you may not hold more than one office, but you may, under this provision, be an officer in the state, in the National Guard, or hold a military office and you may be a notary public, but other offices are prohibited. So you may not be an assistant state attorney or a state attorney and a legislator. So you may not be a sheriff and a member of the Senate. So these provisions become important and sometimes require people to make elections about what office they're going to hold. There's a provision on enemy attack, hopefully not all that significant for us, and has no significant case law. There's a provision on natural resources and scenic beauty. It's been very useful in litigation. It's sort of a make-weight argument saying that Florida's Constitution declares our policy in favor of conservation, but it's probably not enforceable per se, but it's sometimes useful to litigants to try to emphasize that there has been a constitutional statement about natural resources. There is a provision relating to the Everglades, and that does have substance, and we'll discuss that in more detail when you present the cases under Articles 2, Section 7 of the Florida Constitution. And then we reach this remarkable provision, which I hope you'll look at in your Florida Constitution, the Ethics in Government provision. Now, I drafted this provision for Governor Askew, and I must say it is as sorry a piece of draftsmanship as you're going to find anywhere, because it simply does not comply with the provisions of the Florida Constitution. This is the first amendment to the Florida Constitution that was adopted through initiative provision. And so we adopted we drafted this idea, this proposal for initiative before the Florida Supreme Court had begun to develop its jurisprudence on how the initiative provision should be adopted. If you look at the modern case law on the initiative provision for amending the Florida Constitution, you'll find that initiative amendments are limited to a single subject. Well, start through ethics in government and see how many subjects you can find. There's a declaration that office is a public trust. It's a declaration that people have a right to secure that public trust. It provides provisions requiring that people file public disclosure. It has provisions that says that any public officer shall be liable to the state for all financial benefits that have been recovered by the individual who breaches the trust. It has a provision stating that any person who is convicted of a felony involving a breach of trust shall be subject to forfeiture. It has a provision relating to the state legislature. It has a provision establishing an independent ethics commission to conduct investigations. It mentions a code of ethics for state employees and for non-judicial officers. And so the ethics in government provision was the first initiative proposal that was adopted by the people of Florida. It has, in my judgment, done quite a lot of good in Florida. It came at a time when Florida was in considerable crisis. I've mentioned in an earlier lecture the crisis in the Florida Supreme Court, which occurred in the mid-1970s, but there also was a crisis in the Florida executive branch. We had executive officers, including cabinet members, who were accused of improper conduct. A state superintendent of public instruction who had to resign, who was prosecuted. A state controller who was sent to prison. A state treasurer who was sent to prison. A state controller who resigned under investigation. A state lieutenant governor who resigned because he had been found using state employees for private purposes. I mean, we had a crisis in ethics in the state of Florida, and at that time, Governor Askew came forward. Governor Askew sponsored the ethics in government provision, and it's made an immense difference. And so I confess to having drafted something that's entirely faulty under principles, modern principles of constitutional law relating to initiative provisions, but I do not apologize for my participation in this exercise, which achieved, thanks to Governor Askew, a great deal of good for Florida. And so now let's go to Section 9, another absolutely stupid provision in the Constitution. It really turns out not to mean much at all. When you look at the application of this, federal law requires that ballots and other important documents be printed not just in the English language, but in other languages. And as to impact, this constitutional provision has about as little impact as any constitutional provision that you'll find. So that's our overview of Article 2. It's more interesting to lawyers than you might think when you first look at it. It is of critical importance in terms of the history of Florida because of the ethics in government provision, which still has an impact in Florida law. It's important to lawyers because of the separation of powers principle and because of the boundaries, definitions that are in the Constitution, and which now have been found by the United States Supreme Court to be controlling, and so it looks on first glance to be a very boring article of the Constitution. I think you'll find on reflection that it's important, and I have a great suspicion that you may have occasion to use Article 2 sometime in your law practice in just the same way I found occasion to use it in mine. Thank you very much.